contentious.
No, that's fine. I think it gives me an opportunity to speak
Bismillah.
about the
Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Welcome to everyone for another podcast with us here at the LMA. And tonight we've got two special guests. We've got Hanna and we've got Majed Kheir.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum to both of you.
Alaikum salam.
And I'll give a short summary just introducing our two guests. So Hanna is a leading criminal defense lawyer who has acted in numerous high-profile Palestine-related cases in Australia. He's the principal of the law firm Hanna Legal and a co-founder of the Civil Liberties Defence Centre, a community legal service founded in response to the unprecedented criminalisation of political expression during the Gaza genocide. Aside from the law, Nick hosts The What and The Why, an investigative journalism project exposing the role of the Israeli lobby in undermining democratic rights in Australia. And he wrote and directed The Last Guy, a bold documentary about Israel's wars in Gaza and Lebanon and the people fighting back. So welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Khalid.
Thank you. And Majed Kheir, he's a recurring guest, at this point.
No introductions needed anymore.
I'll give another short one again, inshallah. So Majed's, a Sydney-based criminal lawyer known for his strong advocacy on protest rights and civil liberties. Majed has represented and successfully defended pro-Palestine protesters, challenged unjust policing practices, and worked closely with community and religious organizations to confront injustice through the law. So once again, welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
How you both been? How's, how busy, or who's busier than the other these days?
Nah, not much competition. I think Nick has got his hands full at the moment.
Alhamdulillah, everything's okay.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, today we'll cover a range of topics. And the first one I think that we're going to go into is the sentencing of a man who sent a threatening and hateful letter to the LMA and to other Muslim-based organisations. We'll also discuss the historic win of protesters in New South Wales and what it means for our civil rights and how and why this is a win for the community. So we've got quite a bit of questions on that. Mm-hmm. And finally, we're going to touch on the protests in Queensland and, people being jailed for saying specific terms such as, from the river to the sea. So inshallah, we'll touch base on all three. And I think, we'll start off with, the 70-year-old man who sent, a series of threatening letters, including to the Lebanese Muslim Association. Just for context, these letters were very explicit. We were the staff at the LMA and one of the first to actually read these letters. And, it's, I guess the goal of it was to create some sort of fear within the community. Recently, we've been notified that he's received a non-custodial sentence, despite the judge acknowledging that it was a serious offence. So, community have got questions, how can something that's, acknowledged that it's serious gets, a sentencing similar to that? So, do you want to get us started, I think, between the two?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick things off because, ironically, purely by way of coincidence, I was actually in court during that sentencing hearing. I was dealing with a sentence for another matter. Ironically, it was a traffic offence where the person did get a custodial sentence, but that's neither here nor there. Look, in terms of the question of the judge acknowledging it's a serious offence but not imposing a custodial sentence from a purely legal perspective, I don't think that's very problematic. There are serious offences that don't get dealt with by way of jail sentences every single day. It's just about the level of the seriousness. I think, and this is something I've spoken about on this podcast, other podcasts and elsewhere for a very long time, the deeper issue is the charge process. And that's really the remedy that the community is looking for, whether they realise it or not. The problems are never going to be solved with harsher sentences. I think that the root of the issue is what offences police choose to charge in these circumstances. And there's a couple of examples that I'll bring up once I kick over to Nick and give him an opportunity to weigh in. But I think overall there seems to be a two-tiered system when deciding what charges to impose on these sorts of like hate speech style offences, and you're never going to see an equilibrium in terms of the seriousness of sentencing and how the police deal with it until we see a more balanced and equal approach when it comes to deciding what to charge these individuals with.
Nick, any thoughts, any initial thoughts on it?
I agree in part. I think that it's entirely understandable that some part of the community would be upset with the outcome and would feel like their needs haven't been met. But at the same time, I would just caution people against drawing too firm a conclusion from a single sentencing outcome. There's so much information that people aren't aware of. And this phenomenon of people complaining about certain sentences that are imposed on specific individuals is not a new one. It happens every day. I'm sure Majed has had plenty of cases like that. I've had myriad cases like that over the years. And one of the main problems is that people just aren't aware of the complexities of sentencing and all of the factors that the court has to consider. And I'm happy to talk about those, in this specific case. But one thing I'll say though is that I agree with Majed in saying that, we're not going to solve this problem by jailing people. This is a more fundamental problem that I think needs to be confronted, and that is that this is there are deeper societal causes of the conduct that gave rise to the charge for which that person was sentenced. The real issues run deeper, in my view. And I'm not at all seeking to justify or excuse what he did. Of course, it was abhorrent, and it would have been a traumatizing experience for the people who received those letters. But the question is, what leads someone to send the letters in the first place, right? And the reality is, we have a society that is set up to benefit rich people at every juncture, and that disadvantages everyday Australians. And everyday Australians are hurting, particularly now when we're going through an economic crisis, and they're looking for someone to blame. And who does the mainstream media, amongst other institutions, give these people to blame? Muslims. We have this normalisation of Islamophobia in this country that causes a huge segment of our society to have this irrational fear or resentment towards Muslims, thinking that they have more in common with a billionaire like Clive Palmer or Gina Reinhardt than they do with their next door neighbours who are in exactly the same boat as them, except for the fact that instead of being named Joe Blow, they're Muhammad or Zainab, and they've got a beard and a hijab. And so I think it's the people who are peddling this kind of Islamophobia and that cause people like this gentleman, Raymond Brooks, who sent the threatening letters to the mosque. It's those people who should really have the focus of our wrath and should be held most accountable, rather than some 70-year-old man who, mind you, was an alcoholic and was going through pretty serious mental issues at the time, facing extreme financial distress. Again, I'm not seeking to excuse what he's done, but these are important considerations that I think need to be taken into account.
Yeah, agreed. I think that there's probably two really important things to think about, and Nick really hit the nail on the head in terms of societal problems. One thing that we see, and the Muslim community is very familiar with, but only now is like sort of scholarly publications catching up, is when we see economic crises or generally the standard of living decrease. So, for example, things like financial pressures, social pressures, when they increase. So, for example, we are potentially, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but potentially on the brink of a recession. We find a corresponding increase in racism, Islamophobia, and that's something that's across the board in the Western world. It's not unique to Australia. It's something that the United Kingdom, there's a lot of research about, and that's because, like Nick said, hatred has become a currency. And for example, Rupert Murdoch, who is in charge of most major media outlets in this country, who is another one of those billionaires to add to those lists, understands that it's much more beneficial and profitable to direct that hatred and that anger that people are quite rightly feeling, every single Australian is quite rightly feeling because of the pressure, and say, hey, it's not me who pays very little tax compared to a nurse or a school teacher. It's actually your Muslim neighbour who's the problem. They're taking up all the houses and they're taking all your jobs. And look, it's unfortunate that even though this is a pattern that's been recurring for a number of decades now, it doesn't seem to impact its success. No matter how many times we've been through this cycle, we find that it seems to have no trouble taking a foothold. But the other aspect of it that I was touching on was about these charge processes, and I absolutely agree with Nick. You don't jail your way out of any problem, whether it's youth crime, Islamophobia. It never seems to work. The research is pretty clear on that. Legal experts have been very clear on that for a number of years now. But I think we can also look at the institutional practices when it comes to deciding how we charge certain people. Now, as someone who's been very critical myself of our counter-terrorism legislation, particularly some of the new proposed legislation, which we'll get to later on, I would never call for more terrorism prosecutions. I think that's a dangerous game to play, to say, oh, well, we're Muslim and we have a lot of people in our community who get targeted fairly or unfairly by terrorism prosecutions, and we want others to be targeted by it. But I think it's fair to look at whether there is a straight bat being played. And so I referred to a number of examples that I wanted to talk about. I think that the most prominent one that comes to mind, other than this one, Raymond Brooks, was the individual who was sentenced for an assault on a hijab-wearing sister at Bankstown who was wearing also a pro-Palestinian sort of T-shirt. I think it was a shirt bearing the Palestinian flag and it said Free Palestine. And then it was later revealed that she engaged in conduct that I would pretty confidently describe as an attempt on the life of Sheikh Wissam Shakawi. And when I look at those examples and the Raymond Brooks example, I see the commonality between that Sheikh Wissam case, the Raymond Brooks case, and the lady who was attacked at Bankstown. And I see individuals who are engaging in conduct that is likely to cause fear, that's very clearly targeted at the victims or for lack of a better word, because of their religious or political views. I think actually the individual who targeted Sheikh Wissam had actually published a manifesto on her social media accounts, on her YouTube channel, talking about how she was going to target and kill Sheikh Wissam because of his pro-Palestinian advocacy because of his advocacy for Muslims in Australia. So they're targeted because of their religious or political views, and there seems to be quite clear intention to stoke fear within the community, in particular the Muslim community. And so to me, that's really the definition of terrorism. From a legal perspective, I know that in one of those cases, there were no less than 3 barristers, 2 of whom were senior counsel, who issued a written advice, and expressed their view that the conduct absolutely met the definition for terrorism and ought to be treated as such. So that goes back to that charge process I was referring to, that the sentence, we can discuss it all we like. I think it's neither here nor there, honestly. I think there's a real question to be asked. If this was, for example, a Muslim offender who had sent a letter to a synagogue or to a Jewish leader or to a member of the Christian community, or targeting another religious group within Australia, would it have been dealt with as a terrorism matter? I think based on experience, my view would be yes. The real question is then, why is it not dealt with that way in this particular instance? But absolutely, the second limb of that is the societal issues. And I spoke about Rupert Murdoch. I think in the sentencing hearing, it was discussed that this person was brainwashed. I think the word used was brainwashed by Sky News and conservative media outlets.
Yep.
So yeah, something that Nick did touch on that really needs to be examined as well is the role of the media in creating this environment.
Okay. And do we know if any of the recent laws around speech or protest applied to this case or were related at all to it?
This person was charged with sending a threatening letter, which is, I think, an offence contrary to Section 31 of the Crimes Act. That's a long-standing offence. It has nothing to do with the new offences that have been introduced. The only potential role a recent amendment would have had to play was that we now have a new aggravating feature for conduct that, if the offending conduct is motivated by racial hatred. But I think actually, that wouldn't have applied. So no, I think the short answer is it's of absolutely no relevance to the new laws.
It would have aggravated. So I think he had 4 sequences. 2 were relating to letters that he sent to this masjid, also to the Kempa Mosque and the LMA. And then 2 were relating to letters that he had sent to an MP, I think it was Majed Kheir, in relation to the Jewish community.
Yep.
So it would have been an aggravating factor for those sequences, because I believe they would be captured by the racial hatred aggravating provision. But my understanding of the law is that Muslims are not a racial group, it's a religious denomination. And so it's a bit of a odd grey area there.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because Majed referred earlier to the 2-tiered justice system, which a lot of people complain about, this idea that we have a double standard in our criminal justice system. And this question of the definition of race, I think, really highlights that point. Recently, there was a man by the name of Brandon Koshel who was charged and sentenced for a speech that he gave at an anti-immigration rally or a white supremacist rally. I don't think I'm defaming him by calling him a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi. As I understand, that's a title that he accepts. If it's not, then I stand corrected. But he, in that speech, I think he said words to the effect of, the biggest threat to this country are the Jews. It's a comment that I obviously disagree with. I think that it's a repugnant thing to say. But the reason why I bring it up is that he was charged, and I think he was possibly the first person to be charged under a relatively recent offence that was introduced, and that's Section 93Z of the Crimes Act, which is inciting racial hatred. Now, race is defined in that section to include things like colour, ethnicity, nationality, and crucially, ethno-religious group. Now, ethno-religious group, as I understand, it's accepted that that includes Jewish people.
Yeah.
And so he was able to be charged under that offence provision because he had made those comments about Jewish people. But if someone had have made relevantly identical comments about Muslim people, they wouldn't have committed the offence. And I think that's an important example of this double standard. Why? Because as awful as I think what Brandon said is, and to be clear, I should make very clear, even though I'm against what he said, I don't think he should have been charged and I don't think he should have been jailed. I think that he was expressing a political opinion. I disagree with that political opinion, but I believe we should all be free to express our political opinions. But that's another story. That's a story for another day. And I should make clear that I'm not across all the facts of the case. There may have been some other evidence that the prosecution was able to rely on to demonstrate why he had committed that offence. But based purely on the speech, I personally didn't think that would constitute a crime. But back to the point I was making. As awful as I think his comments were, they're extremely mild compared to the kind of things we hear people say about Muslims every single day. Yep. But no one's charged for those comments. And one of the reasons is this two-tiered system on the legislative front, right? The way that certain communities are defined and who meets the definition of a race and who doesn't.
Yeah, who deserves protection really is the question. That offence provision was brought in, I think it was 2021 or 2022. It's relatively recent. Definitely within the last 3 years, that provision was introduced, 93Z and then 93ZA, which dealt with like banned symbols like the swastika and the like. Even more recent than those provisions were, I think we discussed this on an episode that I appeared in, was the legislation around hate groups, banned hate groups, where there was an act which is now passed, which was basically aimed at banning and criminalising certain groups, not because they were extremist or terrorist groups, but because they preached hatred. And I've been very vocal about my concerns with that legislation, but once again, it was identical. I think Stephen Lawrence, MLC, was on that episode that we discussed, and exactly what Nick is saying. It was aimed at banning groups who preached or spread hatred on the basis of those factors: nationality, colour, and ethno-religious identity. And I think the question that we ought to be asking is, if it's accepted, and it is accepted, that the Jewish community are an ethno-religious minority, meaning that their religion and their ethnicity are intertwined, and therefore they're protected by this legislation, what is unique or different about the Jewish community that warrants greater protection versus the Muslim community, who I would quite vehemently argue are the subject of just as much, if not more, hatred in everyday life in Australia? What is it about the feelings of the Jewish community that ought to be protected and preserved more than the feelings of everyday Muslim Australians who, as we go into a cost of living crisis, an economic crisis, understands that the tighter the stranglehold on the average Australian, the more they will feel the backlash. And I think that's quite an appalling thought that perhaps people beyond the Muslim community would struggle to empathise with. That we know when people start to feel the pinch, when there's a greater difficulty in everyday life for the average Australians, we start to worry because we know that we bear the brunt of the backlash, rather than a company like Woolworths, who has seen record profits in the midst of one of the worst cost of living crises of the last 2 decades, right? Or rather than gas companies who, amidst a crisis of supply and routes of distribution, given the Middle East war, are still recording record prices. But the game, as Nick said, has been played for a long time. Hatred is always directed away from the people who it ought to be, in my opinion, people who are profiting off the hatred, people who are profiting off the crises and the struggle of everyday Australians. And so I think that two-tiered system runs very deep, and even in legislation that's only a few months old, we see a similar pattern.
Yep. I mean, we can
Keep
keep
going on
going.
for a
we
long
could go on,
time.
yeah.
The only thing I'll just quickly say is that Majed, I don't think Majed was actually advancing this proposition, but he said if we accept that Jewish people are an ethno-religious group, that's a hotly contested proposition, probably beyond the scope of today's discussion, but there are a lot of people that I think have very compelling reasons as to why we would not accept that proposition and why that this concept of an ethno-religious group is actually being weaponized to advance the project of Zionist colonization in Palestine. But that's, again, a topic for another day.
Absolutely. I think the courts have sort of they've expressed a view. I think there's already common law. It is contested though. I thank Nick for the correction. It's not something that's accepted or conceded. Certainly not by the wider community, but it's something that will play out, I guess, in the courts, and we'll see how judges interpret that, I guess.
Okay, khair, inshallah. Inshallah, we'll move on to the next point, and we can, obviously have kept going, on the first point. And I mean, just from a layperson's perspective, for them, those technicalities, they don't make sense, right? They're like, oh, but you use, you use a word or a phrase or something, for a specific group, it doesn't count for another group. So that's where, just the general community sentiment is, it is a two-tiered, system. Inshallah, we'll move on to, the next point, which, I think we saw you quite prominently, Nick, in the news for. So New South Wales overturning Chris Minns' anti-protest laws. So, I mean, you can probably both give a lot more context to it than myself, but, just very briefly, there were new laws that were introduced. New South Wales brought in some emergency powers after, the terror incident to restrict or block protests. And then they were used during major protests, including Herzog's visit. And, the incident where we saw Sheikh Wissam and a group of the brothers and sisters, that we know when they were praying, and what took place at the time. And then I guess the court decision, eventually was, New South Wales Court of Appeal ruled the laws unconstitutional, said they went too far, restricted political communications. So I guess we're at a point where those laws are invalid, or, how's the community going to take them now that, they've been introduced, incidents have taken place, this ruling comes out, what does it mean?
Sure. Happy for me to go first?
Nick's the man of the hour, this is definitely his forte.
So perhaps just to zoom out and give a little bit of context for the viewers, I think it's important to understand why these laws were introduced in order for us to then understand why the constitutional challenge was brought and why the outcome of that constitutional challenge is so important. So we don't have sort of an inherent right to protest in the sense that we don't have it as an explicit constitutional right and we don't have a Bill of Rights, but we do have certain implied freedoms under our constitution. And more generally, it's always been the case, it has long been the case that the courts and society in general has recognised the important role that the right to public assembly or that public assemblies play in promoting our democracy, right? And for that reason, there have been laws in place that provide protections to people that participate in protests. And probably I won't go into too much detail about what those protections are, but essentially they limit the ability of police to move on people and to prosecute people who are participating in protest and commit minor offences like obstructing traffic or obstructing pedestrians. Now, it's never really been an issue in this country. The problem started when Israel started committing a genocide in Gaza in October 2023. And due to the unprecedented brutality of that offensive, we saw an unprecedented groundswell of opposition. And the birth of what I think is the biggest protest movement we've had in this country in decades. Now, the pro-Israel lobby didn't like that very much. And so there were calls from senior figures within the pro-Israel lobby to shut these protests down from a very early stage. And one prominent example was Gillian Siegel, who is the so-called special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, also a current senior figure within the pro-Israel lobby, the immediate past president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the ECAJ, which is the single largest pro-Israel lobby group. And as an immediate past president, she's still effectively an office holder within that organisation. Now, in December 2024, she participated in an interview with SBS where she called for the Palestine protests to be banned in the major cities, including Sydney. And she's just one of many who made this call. What does our New South Wales government do? Well, Chris Minns last year introduces a law that bans protests, I think, near places of worship. That was the first attempt to curtail this right to protest. There was a challenge that was brought on behalf of the Palestine Action Group, arguing that that law was unconstitutional because the technical expression is that it impermissibly burdened the implied freedom of political communication, which is basically a long way of saying it went too far in undermining the limited freedom of speech that we have in this country. Now, that challenge was successful. Those laws were overturned. The lobby wasn't happy. And fast forward then to December 2025, we have, on the 14th of December, the Bondi terror attack. And in the wake of that attack, many people say that that attack provided a pretext for the government to introduce a raft of laws that it had long wanted to introduce but didn't have a sufficient justification to do so. That perhaps can be the subject of debate, but whether it was a plan that this government had for a long time or not, I don't know. But the reality is that that terror attack facilitated the introduction of these unprecedented laws. And what these laws did was essentially allow the police commissioner to make a declaration called a Public Assembly Restriction Declaration, or a PARD. And the effect of that PARD would be to suspend those protections that I mentioned earlier that have traditionally been afforded to protesters. And the laws were passed on the 23rd of December, and the PARD was made on the 24th of December. And it was continued it was extended for a significant period. Now, on I think the 7th of January, my clients, who at the time were Lizzie Jarrett of Black Caucus, Josh Lees of Palestine Action Group, and Michelle Birkin of Jews Against the Occupation, filed a summons at the Supreme Court seeking that these laws be declared to be invalid on the basis that they're unconstitutional. And Michelle Birkin was later substituted by Paul Silver, who is also from the Black Caucus. The hearing took place in late February, and the decision was handed down a couple of weeks ago. And that decision was that the laws were unconstitutional. As a result, they've effectively been set aside. They no longer exist. But that doesn't undo the damage that was caused by them. Perhaps we can come back to that in a moment. I can give Majed a chance to jump in if he wants to.
Yeah, look, I that's probably as thorough an explanation of the history and the context as you could hope for. But I think what's interesting, and this was one of the reasons I was actually quite excited when I got invited to discuss this, is because I think on the 2nd of February, this podcast aired, and I appeared with Stephen Lawrence the week before the protests that took place on the 9th of February.
Yep.
And Stephen and I expressed our respective views on the legislation. And then I remember telling Stephen towards the end of the podcast that I was very concerned that because of the nature of, or because of the strictness and the broadness of the powers that this legislation conferred on police, along with the political climate, combined with just the absolute outrage and the visceral reaction of the community to the Israeli president being invited, that there was effectively like a pressure cooker that was building. I think the Israeli president's visit was announced in December, like within days or if not a couple of weeks of the terror attack in Bondi on the 14th of December.
It was the 23rd of December.
So it would have been
the 23rd or the 24th, because I know it was the same day as either the law was passed or the pardon was made.
Yeah, and so it built for about 5 weeks where the community was saying we can't have a president who's involved quite directly. I know that the both the state and federal government tried to play it off as saying, well, the president is a ceremonial position within the Israeli government, but let's not make any mistake about it. Isaac Herzog's comments had been directly referenced in South Africa's case to the ICJ as being contributory to what has been deemed a plausible genocide pending further adjudication by the ICJ. But what the community, in terms of the court of public opinion, effectively says it's just unacceptable, horrible, inhumane brutality. And so you had that pressure cooker, and we said, look, we're going to see, I said to Stephen, I think we're going to see some really ugly scenes. I think that we're going to see the cops emboldened and empowered by the sorts of powers they have not had perhaps ever, to effectively say, like Nick said with a pard, say, you are not allowed here. There's a blanket restriction on anyone being in these geographical zones and expressing a political view. And on the other hand, you had the rage building within the community. And so I think it was quite clear that it was going to end up that way. And then when we look at the history that Nick quite thoroughly explained, it was the second attempt and the second failed attempt now by Chris Minns and his government to restrict protest directly in the face of pro-Palestinian, anti-genocidal movement. It wasn't a coincidence. These conversations about our right to protest very seldom took place in politics, in the law. Like, I'm not sure if Nick agrees, but it seemed like it was a non-issue. It came up very rarely, climate activism and things like that, but it was not at the forefront of political discussion the way it has become since 2023, talking about the bill to the taxpayer for protests and its impact on social cohesion. And I think that another thing that's important to note, those are the two failed attempts. There was also a suggestion, which I think is still active, that there'd be a third attempt to curtail our right to protest and our right to political communication by banning certain phrases in this state. And I know we'll get to it later that there were similar laws passed in Queensland. Whether Chris Minns has got the message in terms of an attack on our civil rights is not going to be accepted by the broader community, by the legal community, by people like Nick and Felicity Graham, who appeared as counsel, or whoever it may be. It's not going to be accepted. It remains to be seen whether Chris Minns will still try and pass this legislation. But I think the important thing to note is that the timing is not coincidental. The conversation started with the protests against Israel's genocide. There was an immense amount of pressure immediately placed both on the state and federal government, talking about things like the cost to taxpayer and this broad, wishy-washy, undefined concept of social cohesion, and whether Australians being forced to watch a live-streamed 24-hour genocide for over 3 years impact social cohesion is a question that remains to be answered. I would say that it does. impacts on our ability. I think that the preliminary report by the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism, which was commissioned in the wake of the Bondi terror attack, has already conceded, prior to going into hearings and evidence, that the situation in the Middle East directly plays an impact into the sentiments of everyday Australians. And it clearly does impact how we interact with each other, how we feel, how we go about everyday life. So it was a concerted and coordinated effort following pressure by the envoy to combat anti-Semitism, to attack rights that were previously, I would say, relatively unchallenged by politics and the law.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I had a couple other questions, in mind, and now reflecting, you've actually answered most of them. But I mean, just generally speaking, like, again, for the layperson, your general community member that's not really across, the legal terminology and things like that, how does something that's later found out to be unconstitutional even become law in the first place?
So it's not super common, but it happens, of course. And I think probably the way I would respond to that is by saying that this is an outcome, that is, the successful challenge to Min's anti-protest laws was certainly foreseeable by him and by his government at the time that they passed them. They rushed them through. They were highly controversial laws. There were members of his own government that said that they're going to be overturned on the basis that they're unconstitutional. Countless legal experts, civil society. But those calls were ignored. Mm-hmm. And when you rush through laws without a proper consultation process, it is much more likely that they will ultimately be found to be unconstitutional, right? But to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the Min's government should have just had this longer consultation process to work out the most effective way to introduce laws banning protests or curtailing the right to protest that will still be upheld by the Supreme Court or the High Court. The entire premise of these laws is false, in my view. Yep. As Majed said, these laws were sold to us on the basis that they were to advance social cohesion, which I think Majed correctly referred to as a wishy-washy concept. And the reality is that these laws achieved the opposite, right? They facilitated the police engaging in the most violent crackdown that we've seen on peaceful protesters in this state in decades. That was at the protest on the 9th of February at Town Hall against President Herzog. And the damage that was caused by that crackdown will be felt by those protesters for years to come. I mean, many of these people sustained serious injuries. I helped facilitate 2 pop-up legal clinics for protesters who were victims of police misconduct at the Herzog rally, and Majed was at one of them as well. And the stories that we heard were just shocking. I mean, people that had their bones broken or fractured, abrasions, serious bruising, and that's going to stay with them for a very long time. And so while this win that we achieved, and to be clear, I was just a small part of a big machine, but this win that we as a legal team achieved, while it was clearly very significant, and perhaps I can speak briefly about why it was significant, that won't undo all of the harm that was being caused. And ultimately there needs to be accountability from the government for that harm, because the buck stops with them. They knew, or they should have at least reasonably foreseen, what was going to happen, and they ignored it. And someone needs to pay for that, and hopefully they will. Perhaps before we move on, would you like me to speak about why?
Let's talk about its significance, only because, for the person listening, it's the government knew that it's unconstitutional, or had a pretty good idea that it's going to potentially be overturned, but still went ahead with it. And then your team and went to court. You won the case, and it was a significant victory. But at the same time, there's a bit of maybe thoughts. The thought process is, we didn't even have to go through all of this. Like, what was all this for? Had they just?
It was very avoidable. Yeah, absolutely. I think Nick said that members of Chris Minns' own government warned, alongside everyone else, legal experts, civil society, everyone said that this is just not going to survive judicial scrutiny. Like, meaning, as soon as a court, like a legal set of eyes, a judge, looks at this, there's almost no way that they could say this can sit comfortably alongside our implied constitutional right to political communication. So absolutely this was all avoidable. And I think that in the wake of 14 December, it was a lot easier for both the state and federal government to get legislation. And we've had, legislation was passed within days. You had MPs at the state and federal level brought back from holiday, Parliament sat emergency sessions, legislation that would ordinarily take months, if not years, to debate. There would have been parliamentary Senate inquiries, parliamentary hearings. You would have had all of this consultation to make sure, like, are we doing the right thing? Does this comply with that? Does this sort of sit in line with the Constitution? All of that was bypassed, and so absolutely it was totally avoidable. But my honest opinion, I don't think Chris Minns is happy at the result. Absolutely not. It's a devastating blow for him and his government and his credibility as a premier, because having passed 2 pieces of legislation in the space of 2 years that was quite unceremoniously struck down without much argument as to whether it ought to have been struck down or not. I think it was quite clear in both instances that the law never should have been passed. So it's a massive blow to his credibility and to his government. But I also have a sense that the timing was still relatively convenient for the state government in terms of achieving what it wanted with reference to President Herzog's visit. Like, they did successfully beat down opposition, like physically beat down opposition to that visit. And Nick referenced the legal clinics that he ran. I had the pleasure of attending one of them. It actually wasn't a pleasure. It was an honour to speak to those people, but it was an extremely unpleasurable experience. Nick and I have both interacted with police or interacted with police every single day of our lives. We've seen police misconduct. We've seen what happens when things go south. We've seen people injured in arrests before. We've taken civil action against, but this, even for us, and there were at least a dozen other lawyers who were there, all of whom have extensive experience with those sorts of cases where police sort of go too far, maybe there's violence, something goes wrong. And even for us, I don't want to speak on behalf of all of them, but I think the sentiment for us who have seen that brutality, who've dealt with it, who've represented people who were the victims of it, it was still confronting. Like, such was the severity of the cases that we dealt with. Absolutely, broken bones. The psychological trauma in and of itself will stay with these people for a long time. And I think an important point that I want to touch on before I throw it back to Nick is this. These people, like, we've seen police violence and brutality before. For example, when it comes to bikies, and it comes to, like, for example, national rides, and like, I don't think police misconduct and police brutality is ever justified. But I think there was a demonization of these people who were victims prior to what happened on 9th of Feb. In the wake of Bondi, there was a demonization of the pro-Palestinian movement as a whole, implicating them in that appalling tragedy that happened at Bondi on the 14th of December, somehow trying to shift responsibility to anyone who dared speak up against genocide, somehow saying that they were somehow at fault or involved. And these people who suffered these injuries and who were beaten and pepper sprayed and arrested and charged, and they are overwhelmingly law-abiding citizens, don't interact with the criminal justice system, don't have any criminal history whatsoever, who are what I would describe as morally upright, conscious, humane people who just felt compelled to speak up in the face of what they saw as inhumanity, of brutality, of war crimes, of genocide. And I think that's a really important point. Like, these people, and such is their bravery, they're not the sort of people that will ever seek the limelight and want their praises sung. But I think that it was extraordinarily brave, but they're just not who you would picture. And like I said, I don't think police brutality is ever justified when in terms of police going beyond the scope of what's necessary when arresting or apprehending someone. But they're just not what you would imagine. Like, it was really sad to see young people, elderly people, like parents, teachers, nurses, people who care for you, who look after you, who make your coffee in the morning, who look after you sick in the hospital. It really was sad. And so I think that's an important thing for people to understand, is that it was absolutely disgusting to wield that level of violence and brutality on the members of our community who, quite frankly, don't deserve it.
Yeah, definitely. It was, I mean, the footage was sickening, right? Like, we were actually, our team was flying in from an event in Adelaide, and, you know, when we landed, we saw the footage, and, you know, I mean, even those of us that are usually very well in control, you know, of emotions, but it was just, you know, difficult. It was sickening, very difficult to see. I think we'll segue into the last section, and I think we'll segue by, you know, maybe zooming out a little bit on what we were just speaking about. So just, I mean, overall, why do we think the New South Wales government's been, you know, responded so aggressively to the pro-Palestine movement? And then we'll segue into, you know, certain phrases being banned.
Well, I think the first thing to be clear about is that this inherently involves a degree of speculation. You know, we're not in those private meetings where they are planning what laws they're going to introduce and why. But I think that we do have some information that allows us to confidently draw some conclusions.
Educated guess.
Yeah. I mean, you just cannot ignore the influence that the Israel lobby has in Australian politics, including this state government. And Minns, specifically Chris Minns, his relationship with the lobby goes way back. And so do many members of his government and the opposition. And so we have this bipartisan capture that causes Australian politicians to put the interests of a foreign entity, and not just any foreign entity, a foreign genocidal entity, and its local cheerleaders above those of everyday Australians. And it's for that reason that we have seen this state government introduce law after law that undermines our fundamental rights for the protection of Israel. Mm-hmm. Not for the benefit of anybody else. I mean, they always couch it in terms of, you know, social combating anti-Semitism, social cohesion, community safety. Mm-hmm. But it's got nothing to do with it. That's all a farce. There are countless Jewish people who participate in the Palestine protests or who yell out or chant from the river to the sea. It's got nothing to do with that. It's about protecting Zionists and their feelings. So I think that that's certainly one reason. I think another reason is that Minns has made a decision, rightly or wrongly, that by appeasing the Zionists, he will receive political benefits and he will be rewarded specifically by most of the legacy media, okay, which is dominated by the Murdoch press, which is arguably just an extension of the Israel lobby these days. I mean, it really
overwhelmingly
it's effectively become a mouthpiece, in my view, at least when it comes to these issues. Now, he's made a calculated guess that if I introduce laws and policies that advance Israel's interests over those of everyday Australians, I'm going to be portrayed as a champion in the Murdoch press, and it's doing him well so far. But I think that it's a short-sighted strategy, because people are waking up, and the mainstream is very uncomfortable with the fact that our government is privileging this foreign entity over our own national interests and the national and the interests of the people in this country. This phenomenon is far more advanced in the US, where you've seen, for example, Donald Trump's MAGA base split over people who are who believe that Donald Trump has effectively abandoned the MAGA movement because he's making Israel great again, as opposed to America. But we are also seeing it here, and it's a phenomenon that will continue to develop in this country, and ultimately will be counterproductive for Minns. I think that his popularity will suffer. It's just a question of how long it takes for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the oddity of it, the US example is a little bit different to what we have here, but it's absolutely, the oddity of it is it's creating alliances, like political and ideological alliances that would have been ordinarily unthinkable. So there seems to be this ideological marriage between the left and the right, portions of the left and the right, who are all of a sudden seeing eye to eye, going, hang on a minute, like, I think we can both see that we're being thrown under the bus. Our rights are being sacrificed at the altar of Israel's genocide, and it's just another victim of Israel's genocide. And like I said, like a couple of years ago, that concept would have been quite foreign, if not laughable to us, to think that you'd have the traditionally pro-Palestinian left, although I think the left-right dichotomy is sort of dying in this country, but the traditionally the left of politics being pro-Palestinian to a certain extent, and then the right of politics in terms of liberal governments aligning more with the pro-Israel lobby. I think there's been a lot of quite comical references to Anthony Albanese himself as an individual who's been part of the Labor Party for over 25 years, I think, and how his commentary has changed within Parliament, speeches that he's made inside and outside of Parliament as a sitting MP, and how that's changed since he became Prime Minister. And so such is the severity of the attack by the state government on our civil rights that it's caused both sides of politics in terms of the community and their allegiances to pause and ponder and say, like, why is Israel's right or the pro-Israel lobby of Australia's right to carry out and support a genocide unimpeded more important than our rights, which have been protected by the Constitution and various legislation for over a century? So it's strange to think about, but I think Nick's absolutely right in the sense that for now it seems to be reaping rewards for Chris Minns, but eventually the chickens will come home to roost, so to speak. I think we've seen already in the last federal election we'll see it in the upcoming state election, in my view, and in the next federal election, this move away from the traditional parties for this very reason. I think Nick described our federal government in particular's stance on Israel as being bipartisan. I think that's absolutely 100% correct. We're not these laws are being enacted by Labor governments. This stance on the genocide is with a sitting Labor government, and not just any Labor government. This isn't a Labor government with a lot to lose. This is a Labor government with a super majority in the lower house. Like, they really are in a position of significant strength when it comes to these issues, but we're still seeing what I would describe as a pro-Israeli stance. That's my personal view.
I think it's an Israel first stance.
Israel, yeah, I think you could say that.
Not merely pro-Israel.
That's right, and so it's odd. I think it's odd to think about, but yeah, absolutely, we're going to see this move again continue. It's been going for close to a decade to independent candidates and Greens and all these sorts of options, because people are just saying, why is there no alternative?
Can I jump in here? Sorry, only because I think that raises a very important point. You asked why this government is so hostile towards the pro-Palestine movement. And so we've talked about the role of the lobby and the role of the media, and they're obviously very important parts of the equation, but it doesn't stop there. One of the major reasons why this government keeps being so hostile towards the Palestine movement and keeps passing laws designed to undermine the movement and to undermine any form of solidarity that people have with the victims of this genocidal rampage that Israel is carrying out in Gaza and its campaign of death and destruction across the region, is that there is no pushback. The Muslim community and the Arab community for so long have given these politicians a pass, right? And so they know that they can push an agenda that is anti-Muslim and is anti-Arab, and there won't be any consequences. Yeah. And when Majed talks about the rise of independents and Greens alternatives, that's inevitable, because people again are waking up, and that's why we've seen important movements like the Muslim vote. The Muslim community is waking up and realizing, hey, we can't just keep rubber stamping these elections, right? We need to hold them to account. We need to tell these politicians, hey, if you want our vote, you need to earn it. We're not just going to keep giving it to you for free. And while people are waking up, it's not happening quickly enough. And we still see a lot of institutions that are still having very close relationships with these politicians, not just Minns, but also Albanese. And it's primarily relationships with the Labor Party, because it's this lesser of two evils view, and traditional relationships that have been formed over the past few decades. But at some point we need to realise that genocide can never be the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, there's a red line.
There has to be a red line. And I hope that these institutions wake up and realise that reality very soon, because if they don't, they'll be left behind, and the community will form new institutions. They'll become irrelevant. That's the reality. So it's in their interests, and not only the interests of their constituents, that they adopt a stronger posture when it comes to dealing with governments in the future.
Yeah, I think the scarecrow of the Liberal Party is sort of losing effect in terms of what Nick's saying. At the last federal election, which was, 18 months into the genocide, Peter Dutton was dangled over our heads, in terms of our heads as in the Muslim community, as the scarecrow, as you need to support Labor, as in this was the Labor Party push. You need to support us because your alternative is this person who quite outwardly and brazenly hates your community, who called your very presence in this country a mistake. And as abhorrent as I find that, I think that as the genocide has gone on, as the federal government's lack of action against it has gone on, sort of the fear of that scarecrow has worn off, and absolutely it's happening. I agree with Nick. It's probably not happening fast enough, but it is happening. That people are saying, like, if this is the lesser of two evils, like, how much worse could it possibly get? What support could the Australian government at a federal level and at a state level in New South Wales show to Israel more than it has shown? We've had a Labor government at a state level for close to 8 years now. I think it was 6 years now. Now we're into the second term of a super majority in the lower house at a federal level for the Labor Party. And I don't even think there's been an attempt to even sell it to the Muslim community as there's some sort of opposition or something being done to oppose what Israel's doing at a global level when it comes to the United Nations, every international vote. Up until recently, I think it was seen as quite radical a few months ago. I think it was close to 12 months ago now when the Australian government voted in favour of Palestinian statehood. And like the Israel lobby in this country was up in arms. It was seen as like, oh, you're rewarding terrorism, and all sorts of disgusting punchlines were being echoed throughout conservative media and the pro-Israel lobby. But that on a global level is quite a mild position. Like even in the Western world, Palestinian statehood had been accepted and voted for a number of years ago. Australia has been a bit of an outlier in terms of its pro-US Israel stance on the global level. So I think it is high time that as a community, both on an individual and institutional level, we start to look at how we can gain and obtain better outcomes in terms of our interests and what we want to see, what the sort of action you would expect an Australian government to take in the face of a genocide. And look, we don't need to look very far. It's not hypothetical. It's not like this concept. We've seen it because we saw it with Russia. Mm-hmm. We saw how swiftly and how ardently our federal government spoke out against Russia, supported sanctions, made multiple releases in terms of the Prime Minister's office and the Foreign Minister's office condemning military action against Ukraine. So it's not like we're asking for something that's unprecedented and we don't know what it looks like. We've seen what it looks like. Not only have we seen what it looks like, we've seen this very government engage in that sort of advocacy, if you will, for international law, for the upholding of international law. But again, we were talking about two-tiered justice earlier at a domestic level. I think that same two-tiered justice applies on the international level in terms of how international law is applied when tens of thousands of brown, Muslim, Arab people die versus when traditionally Judeo-Christian, white country and population are the targets of these sorts of war crimes. I personally sleep quite comfortably at night knowing that I hate to see both tragedies occur, and because I think that's a morally consistent approach to take. I just don't understand how anyone can sleep at night with the moral inconsistency of opposing so vehemently the death of one set of people who look a certain way and believe a certain way versus either at best silence or at worst, and this is what we've seen particularly by the Chris Minns government, outright support and cheerleading for the same sorts of things happening to people who look different to you or who practice their faith different to you. But I think change is coming. I don't know if that's the optimist in me, but I definitely think that the community is starting to realise, and the scarecrow of a conservative government is losing its effect.
Yep. Jazakallah khair. I'm wary of time, inshallah, and we are aiming to finish up soon, inshallah.
We can talk. I think the last issue we've got.
We're going to talk about Queensland. About the banning of phrases. the arrest of a 73-year-old, Jewish clinical psychologist, for the use of, the phrase, from the river to the sea, I believe it was. So, I mean, just overall, like, where do we go from here? So, where do we go from here?
Well, as a criminal lawyer, I have a reputation of being a straight shooter. I don't like to pump clients up, give them false hope. I think it's important that you manage expectations in a responsible manner. And I think it would be irresponsible for me to say that everything's going to be fine. We'll be able to resist all of these laws effectively. We'll go back to where things were on the 6th of October. Not that that was a good place, but in terms of the laws that were in place at the time, it was a lot better. But the reality is that I think things will get a lot worse before they have any hope of getting better. We are witnessing the most aggressive assault on our civil liberties in living memory. There has been a raft of repressive laws that have been passed by state and federal governments since October 2023 that are really intended to undermine our ability to criticise Israel and the genocide that it's carrying out in Gaza. Now, that process has only accelerated since the Bondi terror attack last December. One key example is the laws that you just mentioned that have been passed in Queensland. They were passed in March of this year, and they ban the public recital, display or publishing of two, quote, prohibited expressions, being from the river to the sea and globalize the Intifada. And we've seen significant civil disobedience, that is widespread opposition in Queensland to that law, particularly when it comes to from the river to the sea. I think it's important for people to understand why that is. I'm sure most of the viewers will, but we just always must remember that from the river to the sea is a call for justice, and it recognises that Palestine is occupied from the river to the sea, and that all of Palestine needs to be free, and not just the 22% that was captured by Israel in 1967. And it's a phrase that is particularly important to people who are either Palestinian or have a connection to Palestine. I'm not sure if anyone here has, for example, visited the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and seen the horrid conditions that those people live and have been living there for generations, languishing in those camps since 1948. Well, they want to go home. And they've got a right to do so. It's enshrined in international law, but Israel won't respect it. And there are millions of people like them across the region. And unless Palestine is free from the river to the sea, those between 7 to 10 million Palestinian refugees will continue to languish in those camps, as will their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. And so this is a call that is, I think, at the heart of the Palestine movement, and it's not negotiable. Yep. And it's for that reason that we have seen countless people come out in Queensland and defy this ban. I'm acting for a few of them, and there are several lawyers involved. This law will be challenged, and I'm confident that that challenge will be successful and this law will be overturned. Even if it's not overturned, I think that these people have a good defence. I won't bore you with the details now, but I think that hopefully they're going to be successful. But again, that doesn't undo the damage that's been caused. There is a chilling effect that these laws have, right? And there are now countless people who are too scared to say from the river to the sea. because they fear being arrested,
Yeah.
having their home raided, their devices seized. We saw a Catholic charity in Brisbane raided because they had a banner out the front saying "From the river to the sea." Right, so that's how extreme things are getting. So returning to your question about where we're heading with all of this, we're heading to a dark place. But that doesn't mean we should give up. In fact, it's all the more reason why we need to keep fighting.
Yeah.
And there's many ways that we can do that. One is political. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There needs to be strong opposition, a strong alternative to the two-party system, and that will come from the community itself. Initiatives like the Muslim vote, and hopefully there are similar initiatives that take place. But there's also the legal front. And there is a gap in our community that needs filling. For too long we've relied on individual lawyers generously donating their time and skills on a pro bono basis. Majed is one of them. I've been doing a lot of this work for years now, but we've lacked the coordination and the resources that are really necessary in order to meet the needs of the community and to mount an effective pushback. And it's for that reason that and I'm segueing into a shameless plug, if you don't mind.
That's not shameless at all, actually. It's quite an appropriate plug, to be honest.
That some like-minded lawyers and I have recently established a legal service that you referred to in when you introduced me, the Civil Liberties Defence Centre. And we hope to meet those needs of the community. And those needs are growing quickly. And they're going to keep growing as more and more laws are passed and implemented in this country. And so we will have a dedicated hotline for people to call when they are targeted because of their activism or advocacy in support of Palestine. Social media activity, they write something and next minute the police are calling them up.
Yeah. On that point, I think, sorry to cut you off, Nick. Nick was talking about this like gap or shortfall that we have in the community. That gap or shortfall, I think, is really made quite plain when at a legal level we see the sort of coordination and significance of resources, and by resources I mean funding, not just funding but primarily funding from organisations and sections of the community that are quite diametrically opposed to us and the best interests of our community. So I think it's not uncommon. One of my personal experiences, and I'm sure Nick has even more experience than me on this issue, is when we go to fight for causes like this huge win that Nick had, and Nick and the team had at the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago, you'll have at best like one or two solicitors, a junior counsel, if you're really lucky, a generous senior counsel donating their time. The overwhelming majority of the time it's unpaid. They're balancing a very busy practice with this work that they feel committed to for moral or political or ideological reasons. And then you have like a bar table in court where the lawyers sit on either end. And one of the experiences I've had in some of these cases is sitting myself, if I'm lucky, a barrister who's agreed to donate their time and expertise, and then looking across the bar table, and it's not uncommon to see multiple senior counsel. And by senior counsel, for those who don't know, we mean like the most experienced and highly qualified barristers in the state, multiple senior counsel, a legal team of half a dozen solicitors and half a dozen paralegals assisting those solicitors who are assisting junior counsel, who are assisting senior counsel. And so you're coming up against, whether it's the state or institutions, like private institutions and organizations, you're coming up against, to put it like a dollar figure on it, probably millions of dollars worth of legal knowledge, resources, expertise, time. And that's quite daunting. That's my personal experience. I don't know if Nick shares, but sometimes you look across the bar table or you're walking into court and you see like what you're up against. And you've probably, I'm sure Nick has as well, had sleepless nights because you're balancing this work with work that your clients are paying you to do and trying to run your practice successfully. And so the gap that Nick's talking about, that shortfall, is even more, it's exacerbated when you look at the sort of funding and coordination that other sections of the community, and when I say community, I mean the Australian community, pour into these sorts of causes. So I think that, look, it's started to change again. The optimist in me says that it has started to change. I've noticed charities have started to dedicate political advocacy as a particular cause, but the CLDC, which Nick is referring to, will hopefully also serve as a significant balance to this sort of imbalance that exists now. And generally, I think the community needs to get familiar and comfortable with the concept of political advocacy being a genuine cause to support, whether it's through finances or otherwise, because other communities who you may quite vehemently oppose in terms of political ideology certainly see it that way and aren't afraid to give it the resources and the attention that it deserves. And so if we're not doing that, we're certainly going to be beaten to the punch. So this sort of dark path that Nick described that we're heading down will continue to get darker without proper opposition on the legal front. And so I think as a community, we've matured quite a lot over the last few years, and I think part of that process will be accepting that for the last, like my dad has been practicing, and some viewers may know, he's been practicing for over 30 years. And back when he was doing this sort of advocacy for the community, it was like, these lone warrior jobs of lawyers staying up all night, donating their time. And it's like, well, that was 3 decades ago. Maybe it was fit for purpose then, maybe it wasn't. But we got by and they got by, and we, like, for organisations like the LMA, stand on their shoulders and their work, not to say my dad, but just generally, like, people, particularly within the law, who donated their time. There's dozens of them. We could mention them all night, but we need to progress beyond that and say, well, okay, that was good for us as a relatively young community, as a maturing community, but now we're a community that quite proudly boasts significant resources, experts in all sorts of fields, not just the law, and how can we have the ambition to move beyond that?
Yep.
In terms of how we fight for these causes.
SubhanAllah, Majed, I'm not sure if you remember, but I think I asked you a couple months ago, like, do we have an organisation similar to
we had
the Civil Liberties Defence Centre after the Stephen podcast?
Yeah.
So it's fantastic to hear. Yeah. I think just like a final thing, how can people know more about it? How can they get behind it? What can they expect from the organisation, inshallah?
I don't want to cut Nick off, but I think what we'll do, we'll make sure that in the comments of the video there's some more information, but I'll let Nick maybe give a bit more information, but we'll share a link.
Yep.
Sure. So there are a few main ways that we're going to seek to protect the community. The first is by having this hotline that I mentioned, so people will be able to call this hotline and get free advice from a lawyer.
Yep.
In a range of practice areas. To be clear, we are prioritising people who've been targeted because they've spoken out in support of Palestine or Lebanon, etc. We're unapologetic about that, not because we think that it's only the free speech in support of Palestine that matters and should be protected, but because we recognise that it is speech in support of Palestine which is really the test, and at the moment in the current climate, and that it is the primary target of all of the laws and policies that are being introduced in order to stifle free speech. So we will be prioritising people who are experiencing issues because of that issue, but by defending speech in support of Palestine, you're actually defending free speech in general, and you're benefiting the community, the broader Australian community in general, in the same way that the win that we had in the Court of Appeal that overturned the anti-protest laws is not only a win for the anti-genocide movement or for the First Nations justice movement, but for democracy in this country in general. Returning to what we're going to do, we will also provide legal services to people. We will prioritise disadvantaged people who generally can't afford a private lawyer. It'll either be free or low-cost representation. We will provide community education. So many people in the community don't know their rights. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, they're vulnerable. It's much easier for the police to charge them and to, more importantly, successfully obtain a conviction and have these people imprisoned. And so people really need to understand their rights, and that's going to be a prominent feature of our organisation. And finally, advocacy. We will seek to make sure that the interests of those who are being targeted are heard and are advanced.
Absolutely, and I think CLDC. Yeah. Go.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say I forgot to say where people can find out about it.
Yeah,
so,
that's all I'd say.
So on our website, you'll see a link to a Chuffed page where you can donate. We're doing crowdfunding at the moment, and I'd really encourage people to get behind it. To be clear, I'm doing this on a 100% volunteer basis. I have not taken and will not take $1 from the organisation, as are the other directors, but we do need to employ lawyers who can actually do this vital work. And so we're going to need the community support. People, the community should see it as an insurance policy, right? Like you pay now in the knowledge that if and when you need it in the future, and there's a real chance you will, we're going to be there for you.
Yeah, it's an investment. And even if it's not something that you anticipate you'd need, because you're like, I just wouldn't do something like that, this path that we're heading on, this attack on our civil speech, it's quite Orwellian. Like Nick was talking about the from the river to the sea, specifically referencing the factual, undeniable history of occupation and the forcible removal of Palestinians from their ancestral homeland. So we're on this Orwellian path where facts don't seem to matter anymore. And how that relates to the investment that I'm talking about is it's going to get worse. And one day, I don't think it's extreme or implausible to say that even saying Free Palestine might become speech that gets you in trouble. Mm-hmm. And so when you support causes like this, you're effectively making an investment into your own right to speak up for causes like Palestine, and say what you morally and spiritually feel inclined to say. And I think that really goes to the heart of faith-based issues. Like we are, as a starting point, as Muslims, required to enjoin good and forbid evil and speak up in the face of oppression. It's a really foundational concept. وَتَعَاوَنُوا بِالْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. Like be part of goodness. And where there's oppression, make sure you're on the right side of history and speaking out against it. And if you can't do anything about it, the lowest form of opposition and worship is to at least detest it with your heart. But thankfully, most of us as a community are in a position to do more than that by making an investment in causes which will protect our ability to enjoin good and forbid evil. Like, for example, saying Free Palestine, like saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Like I referenced earlier, Chris Minns, it's unclear whether he will pursue a third set of anti-protest laws. I simply don't know. I know that a parliamentary inquiry a few months ago recommended that'll all be passed, banning the phrase globalised the intifada. I don't know if from the river to the sea was considered. It
was considered, but it wasn't recommended.
But globalised the intifada was, bizarrely, because I've been at countless protests over the last 3 years, and I've never even heard it chanted.
That's the irony. Chris Minns made it
He
popular.
made it popular, yeah. Like those Hyde Park protests, which have been happening every single Sunday for the last close to 3 years, never even chanted it. But anyway, the point is, it's not implausible to imagine that those sorts of things will become banned and will need protection to sort of defend ourselves and especially the disadvantaged within our community when they're targeted as a result of these laws.
Yeah, and make no mistake, these laws will disproportionately affect the Muslim community.
Absolutely.
Because Muslims, generally speaking, will never accept what's happening in Palestine and in Lebanon and in the region generally, right?
Definitely.
It's their brothers and sisters, and you just will never be able to suppress that. And so what we will see is inevitable conflict, because you can ban Free Palestine, you can ban any other slogan you like, but you won't be able to stop the Muslim community from championing justice. And so it's inevitable that there will be arrests, charges laid, people prosecuted, and ultimately people sent to jail. That is the Queensland experience. You mentioned, the possibility that in the future, Free Palestine, the expression Free Palestine might be banned. Well, just to give you an idea, in Queensland, it's in addition to the laws that ban the two slogans, From the River to the Sea and Globalise the Intifada, the Queensland government introduced laws which ban certain symbols called prohibited symbols. Now, we have a similar law in New South Wales and at the federal level that bans prohibited symbols, but they are generally limited to symbols which are the symbols of prescribed terrorist organisations. So the 31 organisations listed on the Australian National Security website. In addition, now that Hizb ut-Tahrir has been prescribed as a hate group, its symbol as well. But in Queensland, they went a lot further. And one of the logos, I'm not sure if you saw this mentioned, but one of the logos, I don't think there's been much reporting about this, I could be wrong, but I certainly haven't seen it. One of the logos is the Shahada. Right? Yeah. Now, I don't know if that was just an error, because it's the Shahada that's written sort of in a similar way that the Jabhat al-Nusra, not the ISIS flag, the Jabhat al-Nusra flag. But the Jabhat al-Nusra flag has Jabhat al-Nusra written underneath it. This one doesn't. It's just the Shahada. Black flag with the white text on top, right? So the Muslim community is extremely exposed. And that's just one example of, I think, many of how vulnerable this community is and how desperate the need is for legal protection and assistance. Yeah, even at the federal level, that was a really interesting point, Nick. Even at the federal level, not many people know this, and it's never actually become an issue, but one of the Commonwealth legislations which bans prohibited symbols associated with those 31 terrorist organisations also bans symbols, and the exact wording of the legislation is which so nearly resembles the symbols of those terrorist organisations. And so when you think of Jabhat al-Nusra or Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a separate list but still a banned organisation, or ISIS and the flag and the symbols, they all incorporate the Shahada to some extent. And so one thing that I've had the privilege of working with a number of lawyers on and a number of community organisations on is pointing out, in terms of law reform, that like the Quran in and of itself like has the Shahada, or like things which so nearly resemble the Shahada. And like, so it always, I think what Nick said was that the Muslim community always end up disproportionately affected, because the laws, by their very construction and design, will incorporate aspects of everyday Muslim life and faith and target the Muslim community, whether intentionally or not, and have a view on that I probably won't share now, but they do seem to, in practical effect, cause young Muslims to be
to be, in particular, young Muslim men. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Like, we saw the raids on Muslim teenagers, 13, 14 years of age, about 18 months ago. We saw 7 Muslim men who travelled from Melbourne who were rammed by a unmarked police vehicle, which was a Toyota Land Cruiser. They all suffered significant injuries. They were beaten and then released. I think it was like 48 hours later without charge. And it's like, oh, you see you later, go home, enjoy the rest of your life. We're sorry, we got it wrong. Actually, I don't think there was an apology. I'm probably being far too generous to the police by saying that. And so it's certainly within or in line with the experience of the Muslim community over the last 30 years that this legislative push will ultimately result in young Muslim men being incarcerated, being charged, and having their livelihoods as a natural byproduct of going through this process, their livelihoods permanently in disarray. Because one thing that's undeniable is that no matter what happens, once you go through the criminal justice system, it's very difficult to get your life back on track, no matter what the outcome is. And that goes back to the tragedy of 9 February and those people who were arrested and charged and mistreated at the Herzog rally, not to flog a dead horse, but this is sort of what we're looking at and what we're staring in the face of as a Muslim community, and why we need to sort of get on the front foot and not be reactive and make sure that certain safeguards are in place, like ensuring there's a funded organisation that's ready to assist people like 14-year-old Muslim men who have their doors bashed in at 2 a.m, who are dragged out and can be held for hours and days at a time without charge. And not every family is in the position to call a lawyer unless they find a very generous lawyer like Nick, who's willing to give up his time, and to call a lawyer and have a lawyer and a barrister there at their beck and call to assist. But yeah, definitely a cause for us to get behind, and something for us to bear in mind.
Yep, definitely. We've surpassed the 7:30 mark, so inshallah
just about.
We'll finish up very soon, and we'll be keeping a very close eye on the CLDC, inshallah.
If there are any sort of questions you want to get by, I don't know if Nick's got a hard stop. Maybe we can finish with that if there's anything in particular online or that's come through the last few days.
I think we've covered almost everything, inshallah. But definitely more keen to hear about how he goes and to see how we can support. Majed, Nick, it was a pleasure to have you both here tonight, and again, thank you for your time.
A pleasure to be
for being here, inshallah.
Thank you, Khalid. It was a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone that tuned in, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Just one last thing before we close up, Khalid.
Yeah.
See if is there anything that the gentleman would like to plug, like within 30 seconds before we just close off, if that's okay.
I've done enough plugging.
I don't have anything to plug. No, I think if anyone's going to Hajj, actually, good reminder. If anyone's going to Hajj, get your wills sorted before you go. We are for the 25th year running doing pro bono wills, so free of charge. Prepare your will before you go to Hajj. It's really, really important. Hajj is like a big journey. It's long travel, and it's one of the things that you want to make sure is sorted before you go. It's part of the sunnah, is to not travel or undertake any sort of significant undertaking in your life until your will is sorted. So we're very, very happy to get your will sorted for you free of charge before you take off. And there's only, I think, a week to go before the first Hajj group start leaving on the 11th of May. So yeah, very, very happy to assist anyone travelling to Hajj.
That's Kheir Lawyers, correct?
Yeah, Kheir Lawyers. I should say. We're not dragging Nick into it. He's got enough on his plate.
If you're travelling to
CLDC,
Hajj,
he's got enough to do.
They're not going to incorporate wills anytime soon.
Okay. Again,